It was a bright and sunny afternoon, and the city was buzzing with excitement. People from all over had gathered along the streets, eager to see the royal family pass by in their grand parade. Flags fluttered in the wind, and the air was filled with the sound of chatter and laughter as families, tourists, and locals stood in anticipation. Today was a special day, one that everyone would remember. Among the crowd, there was a woman named Karen. She was wearing a bright red jacket and had a look of determination on her face. Karen didn't like waiting, and today she was feeling more impatient than ever. As the royal procession was scheduled to begin, she was standing near the back of the crowd. Karen wasn't used to being in the middle of things. She liked being at the front, always where the action was. So, today, she was on a mission. She elbowed her way through the people around her, murmuring under her breath about how unfair it was to be stuck at the back. Everyone else seemed to be fine with waiting, but not Karen. She felt like she deserved a better view. She scanned the area, looking for an opportunity to get closer to the royal procession, perhaps even sneak a spot at the front. But it wasn't going to be that easy. There was a group of tourists standing ahead of her, and they seemed to be taking forever to move. Karen stood still for a moment, her frustration growing. She could see the royal guards, tall, strong, and uniformed, standing at attention, forming a perfect line along the parade route. She couldn't wait to see the royal family. She wanted to be right at the front, like everyone else. She started tapping her foot impatiently, her arms crossed tightly. "Why is it always like this?" she muttered to herself, louder than she had meant to. These people have no sense of urgency. Her eyes narrowed as she watched the group ahead of her continue to talk among themselves, oblivious to the fact that they were blocking her path. Finally, she couldn't take it anymore. Without thinking, she pushed her way forward, tapping one of the tourists on the shoulder. "Excuse me, can you move over?" she snapped. The tourist looked at her, confused but stepped aside. But Karen wasn't done yet. She started to walk closer to the front, where the royal guards stood. As she approached, one of the guards noticed her. His tall, uniformed figure was unmistakable. The guard, a young man with sharp eyes and a calm demeanor, stepped forward, blocking her path. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but you can't move up here. Please return to the designated area." His voice was polite, but firm. Karen wasn't pleased with this at all. She felt like she deserved better. She couldn't believe he was telling her what to do. "Are you seriously stopping me?" she huffed. "I've been waiting just like everyone else. I deserve to be closer." The guard stood his ground. "I understand, but you'll need to stay behind the line." Karen's face turned red with anger. This was ridiculous. How could he deny her the chance to be in the front, just like everyone else? She wasn't going to let this slide. Her patience had run out. The royal family was only moments away, and she wasn't about to let some guard stop her from getting a better view. That's when Karen made a decision. Without warning, she raised her hand and slapped the guard across the face. The sound of the slap echoed down the street. A shocked silence fell over the crowd as they all watched in disbelief. Karen stood there, smirking, certain that the situation would blow over, and she would get what she wanted. But what happened next would surprise her more than anything. The moment Karen slapped the royal guard, the crowd around her froze. For a second, it was as if the whole world had paused. People gasped, eyes wide in shock, and whispers quickly spread through the onlookers. No one had expected this. The guard, however, stood completely still, his expression unreadable. His face had turned slightly red from the force of the slap, but he didn't move a muscle. Karen, on the other hand, didn't seem to understand the seriousness of what had just happened. She stood there with a smirk on her face, thinking that the situation would blow over. She had expected the guard to step aside or even apologize, but instead, he just looked at her. His calmness made her even more frustrated. "Are you going to just stand there?" Karen demanded, her voice rising in anger. "I deserve to be at the front. You can't stop me." The royal guard didn't respond right away. He simply adjusted his posture, his eyes still locked on hers. His silence made Karen even more uncomfortable. The crowd around her, however, was beginning to murmur. People started to realize what had happened. The man who had been slapped wasn't showing any sign of anger or retaliation. In fact, he was handling the situation with the kind of calm that most people couldn't even imagine in such a tense moment. But that calmness made Karen even angrier. How dare he stand there like nothing happened? Didn't he know who she was? She was used to getting what she wanted, and this situation was no different. She had slapped him, and now she expected him to apologize for standing in her way. Still, the guard said nothing. He simply turned to his fellow soldiers, who had been watching quietly from a distance. They exchanged a few quiet words, but no one made a move toward Karen. The crowd, meanwhile, had begun to notice the tension between them. It was clear that something wasn't right. People were starting to feel uncomfortable with Karen's behavior, and whispers of disapproval started to grow louder. One man in the crowd leaned over to his friend and whispered, "Did she just slap a royal guard? What's she thinking?" Another woman, shaking her head, muttered, "Some people really think they're above the rules." Karen could hear the whispers, but they only made her more determined. She felt like she had every right to be at the front. It didn't matter that she had just slapped a royal guard. She wanted to see the royal family, and no one was going to stop her. At that moment, a young woman in the crowd, standing behind Karen, tapped her on the shoulder. "You should apologize to him," she said softly. "That wasn't right." Karen spun around, her face turning redder. "Apologize?" she scoffed. "Why should I apologize to him? He's the one who was in my way." But the crowd wasn't buying it. The people around her began to look at her with disapproval. The young woman's voice was calm, but everyone else was beginning to agree with her. You can't just treat people like that, especially someone who's just doing his job. Karen felt the eyes of the crowd on her, and for the first time, she began to feel a flicker of doubt. This wasn't going the way she had imagined. She thought the situation would end quickly, with her at the front of the crowd, but now things were escalating in a way she hadn't expected. As she stood there, unsure of what to do next, the royal procession began to draw closer. The royal guards remained in their positions, and Karen realized the parade would soon begin, with or without her at the front. But what would happen next? Would the guard let her go, or would the crowd make sure that Karen faced the consequences of her actions? The tension in the air was thick, and Karen's smug expression was slowly fading as the reality of the situation set in. As the silence stretched on, the royal guard remained calm, standing still as though nothing had happened. His stoic expression never changed, even though everyone around him was shocked by Karen's slap. He took a deep breath, letting the tense moment pass without reacting. His body was perfectly still, showing no sign of anger or frustration. The guard's professionalism was evident, and it was clear that he had been trained for situations like this. Karen, on the other hand, was growing more impatient. She expected some kind of reaction from him, perhaps even an apology or a shout to get her out of the way. But instead, the guard just looked at her with unwavering focus, not giving her the satisfaction of a response. His silence only made her more annoyed. "Are you just going to stand there?" she demanded again, her voice shaking with frustration. "I'm telling you, I'm going to the front." But the guard didn't move. He simply looked at her, his eyes steady. The crowd, which had been shocked into silence moments earlier, was now whispering to each other. Some of them were still in disbelief about what had just happened, while others were beginning to feel uncomfortable with Karen's behavior. It was clear that people were starting to take sides. Some were starting to feel sympathetic toward the guard, while others were losing patience with Karen's attitude. Karen glanced around, realizing that the situation was not going as she had hoped. The crowd was no longer just watching. They were starting to take notice of her rude behavior. Some people were even starting to frown at her, shaking their heads in disapproval. It wasn't long before a man in the crowd spoke up. "You need to apologize," he said firmly, his voice cutting through the murmurs. That was uncalled for. Karen turned toward him, her face flushing with embarrassment. Apologize? For what? She snapped, clearly upset. I'm just trying to see the parade. There's no reason for him to stand in my way. But the man wasn't backing down. You slapped him. That's not how you treat people. Especially not someone who's here to protect us. The words hit Karen harder than she expected. She had always been the kind of person who believed that she deserved special treatment. But now, faced with the reality of the situation, she could feel the pressure mounting. The whispers in the crowd were growing louder, and she began to realize that the eyes of the people were no longer filled with curiosity or amusement. They were filled with judgment. Karen's smirk started to fade as she realized that the guard wasn't going to back down. He wasn't going to yell at her or get upset. He wasn't going to give her the drama she expected. He was simply doing his job, standing tall and waiting for the parade to continue. The young woman who had spoken earlier, the one who had told Karen to apologize, now stepped forward. She looked Karen directly in the eyes and spoke with calm authority. You should show some respect. This man is just doing his job, and you've already made a fool of yourself. Karen opened her mouth to argue, but no words came out. The anger that had burned inside her now seemed to fizzle out. She had expected to get away with her behavior, but now the reality of what she had done was sinking in. The crowd wasn't supporting her. In fact, they were beginning to speak out against her. She was the one who was in the wrong, and everyone could see it. As the parade grew closer, Karen stood in the middle of the crowd, unsure of what to do next. The royal guards remained in their position, unwavering, and Karen's earlier confidence was now replaced with a growing sense of unease. She could feel the weight of the crowd's disapproval, and for the first time, she wondered if she had pushed things too far. As the royal procession slowly moved closer, Karen's earlier confidence continued to fade. The more she looked around, the more she realized how many people were watching her, their eyes filled with judgment. She shifted uneasily, feeling the heat of their gazes on her. She had expected to get away with what she had done, but now it seemed impossible. The crowd was starting to whisper, their voices rising with every passing second. It was as if the air had changed, thick with disapproval. People were no longer talking about the royal family or the parade. They were talking about Karen and what she had done. One person, an older man standing a few feet away, shook his head and muttered, "Some people have no respect. He's just doing his job." He looked at Karen, then at the royal guard, who remained silent, his stance unshaken. Karen's face flushed with embarrassment, but she refused to back down. She opened her mouth to say something, but her words seemed to stick in her throat. She knew that no matter what she said, it wouldn't undo the slap, and it wouldn't change the way the crowd was starting to see her. Meanwhile, the royal guard remained calm. His steady, composed demeanor only made the situation more tense for Karen. He wasn't yelling at her or retaliating. He wasn't even giving her the satisfaction of an argument. The more he stayed silent, the more Karen felt as if she were losing control of the situation. A woman standing next to Karen turned to her and said in a soft but firm voice, "You should apologize. He didn't deserve that." Her words weren't harsh, but they carried the weight of the crowd's growing disapproval. It wasn't just one person now. More and more people were starting to voice their frustration with Karen's behavior. Karen bit her lip, her mind racing. She didn't want to apologize. She felt like she didn't have to. But the tension around her was growing, and she could see that people were beginning to lose patience with her. She could hear the whispers getting louder, and the more she heard, the more she realized that this wasn't going to end the way she had hoped. The royal procession was now just a few moments away, and Karen couldn't help but feel the pressure mounting. The crowd had already started to cheer, their attention turning toward the approaching royal family. But Karen wasn't focused on the parade anymore. She was too aware of the eyes on her, the judgment from the people around her. Suddenly, a man who had been quietly observing the scene stepped forward. He was middle-aged, dressed in a simple shirt and jeans, but his voice was clear and firm. "What she did was wrong," he said loudly, speaking to the people around him. "You don't treat someone like that, especially not a royal guard. He's just doing his duty." The crowd fell silent for a moment, the weight of his words settling in. Then, one by one, people started nodding in agreement. The man's words seemed to break through the tension, and Karen felt a wave of embarrassment wash over her. She hadn't expected the crowd to turn against her like this. The whispers grew louder again, but this time, Karen wasn't the one they were whispering about. The focus had shifted. People were no longer talking about Karen as someone who could do whatever she wanted. They were talking about her actions and how disrespectful they had been. The royal guard had become a symbol of professionalism, while Karen was now the person everyone was shaking their heads at. Karen looked at the royal guard again. He was still standing tall, showing no sign of anger or frustration. His calmness only seemed to magnify her own discomfort. The parade was just about to begin, and Karen realized that no matter what happened now, she wouldn't be getting the special treatment she had expected. The crowd had already made up its mind, and the situation had turned in a direction she hadn't anticipated. As the royal procession drew closer, the excitement in the air was palpable. The sound of trumpets echoed through the streets, signaling that the royal family was about to make their grand entrance. The crowd cheered, and the mood seemed to shift from tense to excited. People were finally focused on the parade, eager to see the royal family pass by. But for Karen, the moment felt completely different. She could hear the cheers and see the smiles of the people around her, but she couldn't shake the feeling that everyone was still watching her. The royal guards, who had been standing firm in their positions, began to move into formation as the royal family's carriages approached. The royal procession was always a magnificent sight, with beautifully decorated carriages and regal attire. But Karen's attention wasn't on the parade anymore. She couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened, about how she had slapped the guard, and how the crowd had reacted. The weight of the situation hung heavy in the air, and the excitement of the royal procession was quickly fading for her. As the carriages came into view, the crowd erupted into cheers once again. People waved flags and shouted with excitement. The royal family waved from the carriages, smiling and acknowledging the crowd. The atmosphere was filled with joy, but Karen was still stuck in her moment of discomfort. From where she stood, Karen could see the royal family's eyes scanning the crowd. They were used to being in the spotlight, but today, it seemed like the spotlight was shifting toward Karen. Some members of the royal family, who were used to observing the crowd, took notice of what had just happened. One of the royal advisors, a woman in a fine gown, noticed the scene unfolding near the royal guard. She could see the tension and the whispers in the crowd, and her sharp eyes quickly picked up on the situation. The advisor walked over to the royal guard, speaking with him for a moment. The guard nodded, and the advisor turned her attention toward Karen. She had been watching the entire situation unfold, and now it was clear that Karen's behavior had drawn the attention of the royal family. As the royal carriages continued to pass by, the advisor made her way toward Karen, her steps firm and purposeful. People in the crowd began to notice her approach, and some started to whisper. The atmosphere shifted again, and Karen could feel her heart begin to race. She had no idea what the advisor was going to say or do, but she couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get worse for her. The advisor, calm and composed, stopped right in front of Karen. Her eyes met Karen's, and for a brief moment, it felt as if the world had stopped moving. "Excuse me," the advisor said politely, but there was a firmness to her voice. "We expect all members of the public to show respect toward the royal guards. This kind of behavior is not acceptable." Karen opened her mouth, but the advisor raised her hand slightly, signaling her to remain silent. "You've already caused enough disruption today. I suggest you leave the area before this escalates further." The crowd, which had been watching the exchange, seemed to hold their breath. Some people looked at Karen sympathetically, but most were watching her with a sense of disbelief. It was clear that Karen's behavior had caused more than just a momentary issue. It had now become a public spectacle. Karen stood there, unsure of what to say. She had thought she could get away with her actions, but now she realized that the situation had spiraled out of control. The advisor's words had a weight to them, and Karen couldn't deny that she had crossed a line. As the royal family's procession continued, the royal guard, now standing tall and unflinching, returned to his position. Karen, still reeling from the advisor's words, slowly stepped back from the crowd. She had been given a clear warning, and for the first time, she realized that her actions would have consequences. The royal advisor's words echoed in Karen's mind as the crowd began to settle. The royal procession continued, with the carriages now making their way down the street, but Karen was no longer paying attention to the parade. She was lost in thought, trying to figure out how to get out of the situation she had created. Her mind raced as she quickly calculated her next move. This was not how she had imagined the day would go, and she was determined not to let it end with her being embarrassed in front of everyone. Karen glanced around, hoping the crowd's focus had shifted back to the royal family. Some people were still whispering and staring at her, but many had turned their attention to the spectacle in front of them. This was her chance. If she acted quickly, maybe she could smooth things over before things got worse. She took a deep breath and turned back to the royal advisor, who was still watching her closely. Karen pasted a smile on her face, trying to appear calm and composed. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice a little too high-pitched. "I didn't mean to cause any trouble. It was just a misunderstanding. I wasn't thinking clearly." The advisor raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. Karen pushed forward, hoping to salvage some dignity. I just got so excited about the parade, you know. It's such a big event, and I just wanted to be closer. I didn't think my actions would cause any harm." The advisor didn't respond immediately, but her cool gaze made it clear that she wasn't buying Karen's explanation. Karen continued, her voice now more defensive than before. "I'm sure it wasn't a big deal. I'm sure the guard didn't mind. He didn't even react right. It's just a little slap. Nothing major." At this point, the crowd was beginning to notice Karen's attempt to downplay the situation. Whispers began again, though this time they were less about the guard's professionalism and more about Karen's refusal to take responsibility for what she had done. The advisor's expression remained neutral, but the people around her were starting to look at Karen with disappointment. "You're not listening," the advisor said calmly, her voice firm. "This was not a little slap, and it wasn't just a harmless mistake. It was a disruption that affected everyone around you. The royal guards are here to maintain order, and you've shown a lack of respect toward them." Karen felt a sinking feeling in her stomach. She had hoped to brush it off, but it was becoming clear that the situation wasn't going away. She was losing the crowd, and worse, she was losing face. Her usual tactics of talking her way out of things weren't working this time. She tried one last attempt, her voice softening. "I'm really sorry, okay? I'll just go back to my spot, and we can forget this ever happened. I'm sure everyone will forget about it once the parade is over." But the advisor wasn't having it. "It's not about forgetting. It's about understanding that actions have consequences. What you've done here today cannot be erased with a simple apology." Karen stood there, her smile now faltering. The weight of the advisor's words was sinking in, and it was starting to feel like there was no way out. She had thought she could walk away from this without any consequences, but now she realized that the crowd had made up their mind. A few people around her began to speak up, murmuring in agreement with the advisor's point. Karen glanced around and saw the looks of disapproval on the faces of the people nearby. They weren't just watching her anymore. They were judging her. She had expected to be the one in control of the situation, but now she was just another person in the crowd, feeling small and embarrassed. The royal advisor gave one last look at Karen before turning away, signaling the end of their conversation. The crowd, sensing that Karen's attempts to wiggle out of the situation had failed, began to focus again on the parade, but the air had changed. Karen had lost her chance to slip away unnoticed. As the last of the royal family's carriages passed by, Karen slowly stepped back, her head lowered. She didn't know what else to do. She had caused a scene, and now everyone around her knew it. Her day at the parade had turned from excitement to embarrassment, and she was left standing at the edge of the crowd, wishing she could undo everything that had just happened. Karen stood there, feeling the weight of the crowd's eyes on her. The royal procession was finally nearing its end, and the excitement that had once filled the air had now been replaced with a strange, tense silence around her. The last of the royal family's carriages had passed, and the parade was almost over. The music and cheers were fading, but for Karen, it felt as if time had stopped. She had thought that if she apologized, the situation would blow over, but now she could see that it wasn't going to be that simple. The crowd wasn't going to forget what had happened. The royal guard's calm demeanor had made her look even worse, and the advisor's words still echoed in her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that the whole day had turned against her. Her plan to get close to the front and enjoy the parade had backfired in the worst possible way. The people around her were slowly beginning to disperse, but many still lingered, talking among themselves. Some were giving her sidelong glances, while others seemed to be avoiding her altogether. It was clear that Karen had lost the crowd's respect. She had tried to downplay her actions, but they had seen through it. As the last of the spectators made their way down the street, Karen realized that the day had become a turning point for her. This wasn't just about the parade anymore. It was about how people saw her, how they judged her actions. She had thought that the world should bend to her will, that she could push her way through any situation without consequences. But today had shown her that things didn't always go the way she expected. Karen took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. She glanced at the royal guard, still standing with his fellow soldiers, their posture perfect and unwavering. He had handled everything with such grace and composure, and Karen couldn't help but feel a growing sense of respect for him. It was a feeling she rarely had toward others, but in this moment, she could see how he had acted with dignity, while she had acted impulsively. Her eyes lingered on him for a moment longer, and then, without a word, she turned and walked away. The crowd had all but vanished, and the street was beginning to empty. Karen knew she couldn't change what had happened, but she could at least leave with some dignity intact. As she made her way to the exit, she could feel the eyes of a few people still on her, but this time it wasn't the same. There was no judgment in their gaze, only a quiet acknowledgement. It was as if they understood that Karen was leaving the scene, her lesson learned, but her pride still intact. Karen walked slowly, reflecting on everything that had occurred. She realized that she had been wrong to think she could get away with treating others poorly. The royal guard, despite being slapped in front of the crowd, had remained calm and professional. He hadn't reacted with anger, and that had left a lasting impression on her. As she reached the edge of the street, Karen stopped and turned around. She took one last look at the spot where the royal guard had stood, her thoughts filled with a strange mixture of guilt and admiration. She knew she couldn't undo what she had done, but for the first time, she understood that actions had consequences, especially when it came to showing respect for others. The parade was over, and the day had ended, but Karen was left with something more valuable than just a memory of a royal event. She had learned a hard lesson about how respect and dignity could make a difference in how people saw her. The day was finally coming to a close, and the excitement of the royal parade had faded away with the setting sun. People were slowly dispersing, heading home after the grand spectacle. The street was quieter now, with only a few lingering groups of people chatting about the event, but Karen's mind was still racing. It had been a long day, one she would never forget. As she walked home, she couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. She had always prided herself on getting what she wanted, never letting anything or anyone stand in her way. But today, things had been different. The crowd's reaction, the royal advisor's words, and the calmness of the royal guard had made her realize just how wrong she had been. She had thought that a simple slap wouldn't matter, that she could brush it off and continue on with her day. But the reality was far from what she had expected. The more she thought about it, the more Karen understood the power of respect. It wasn't just about being polite or saying the right words. It was about truly considering how your actions affect others. And in this case, she had failed to do that. Karen's pride had been hurt, but it wasn't the kind of hurt she was used to. This time, it wasn't from someone trying to put her down or criticize her. It was from realizing that she had crossed a line, that her behavior had disrupted not just the event, but the people around her. The royal guard had shown her something important. His calmness, his ability to stand tall without reacting to her anger, had left a deeper impression on her than she had ever expected. As she walked, Karen thought about the people who had been there, those who had witnessed the whole scene. Some had been angry, others had been disappointed, but most had simply been silent. It was the silence that had stuck with her. No one had applauded her behavior. No one had cheered her on. In fact, the more she thought about it, the more she realized that she had been isolated in her own arrogance. Everyone else had stood together in their respect for the guard and for the parade. She had imagined that the crowd would understand her frustration, that they would see her point of view. But in reality, they had seen a woman who was too focused on herself, too willing to disrespect others just to get ahead. She had failed to recognize that there were people around her, people with their own lives and stories, who deserved respect as much as she did. The royal advisor's words echoed in her mind once again. What you've done here today cannot be erased with a simple apology. Karen had thought she could fix things easily, but she now realized that some mistakes were bigger than that. They weren't just about saying sorry. They were about understanding the impact of one's actions and learning from them. By the time Karen reached her home, the sun had set completely, and the streetlights had turned on, casting a soft glow over the neighborhood. She stopped for a moment before going inside, taking a deep breath. She had learned something today, something important. She had learned that respect wasn't something that could be demanded. It had to be earned through actions, through kindness, and through understanding. As Karen walked into her house, she felt a sense of quiet reflection. The day had not gone as planned, but it had taught her a lesson she would not forget. She wasn't sure what the future held, but one thing was clear: respect for others, no matter who they were, was something she would carry with her from now on. The days that followed the royal parade were a little quieter for Karen. The excitement and chaos of the event had settled down, but the lesson from that day stayed with her. Every time she walked down the street or encountered someone she didn't know, she couldn't help but think back to how she had acted in front of the crowd. She had been so focused on what she wanted, on getting to the front and being seen, that she had forgotten about the people around her. It wasn't just about the slap. It was about everything that had happened afterward. Karen began to notice how her interactions with others were changing. She had always been the type to demand things her way, expecting people to move aside for her. But now she found herself taking a step back, listening more, and considering the feelings of those around her. She didn't always get what she wanted, and that was okay. What mattered more was treating people with respect, no matter who they were or what role they played. The royal guard's calm demeanor had stayed in her mind. He hadn't reacted to her slap with anger or frustration. He had simply remained professional, his quiet strength a reminder of how she should act in situations where she felt challenged. His actions had left a lasting impression on her, and Karen began to realize that there was strength in showing respect, not weakness. She had thought that being bold and demanding was the key to getting what she wanted, but now she saw that true strength came from composure and respect for others. At work, Karen noticed the difference in how people treated her. She wasn't used to people giving her space or offering help without her asking. It was a new feeling, one that made her uncomfortable at first. But then she started to appreciate it. People were treating her with kindness, not because they had to, but because she had shown them respect in return. One afternoon, as Karen was walking home from work, she saw the royal guard again. He was standing with a group of people, chatting casually, his uniform now replaced with a simple outfit. Karen recognized him immediately, and for the first time since the incident, she felt a wave of gratitude toward him. She hesitated for a moment, wondering if she should approach him, but then she decided to. She walked up to him slowly, feeling a little nervous. The guard looked up, recognizing her too, and smiled warmly. "Hello," he said politely. "Hi," Karen said, her voice a little unsure. "I just wanted to say thank you. I know I made a fool of myself that day of the parade, but I've been thinking about it, and I've learned a lot. You handled the whole thing with so much grace, and I just wanted to apologize for my behavior." The guard nodded, his smile not fading. "I appreciate that," he said. "We all make mistakes. The important thing is to learn from them." Karen smiled, feeling a weight lift off her shoulders. She had expected him to be angry or dismissive, but instead he had been understanding and kind. It made her feel like she was on the right path, that maybe she could make things right after all. As Karen continued her walk home, she felt different. She wasn't the same person she had been before the royal parade. The lesson she had learned wasn't just about the slap or the crowd's reaction. It was about taking responsibility for her actions, understanding the importance of respect, and treating others with the same dignity she hoped to receive. The parade may have ended, but the lesson from that day was something Karen would carry with her for the rest of her life. She knew she still had a long way to go, but for the first time, she was eager to keep moving forward.